Okay, so I'll introduce our speaker for today. Today, Melinda Ellison, the U of I Extension Sheep and Goat Specialist, is going to be talking to us about genetic improvements you can make in your herd through ewe and doe management. So I'll let Melinda get started. If you guys have any questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A box, and I'll make sure to ask Melinda those questions during her presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carmen. So today I just wanted to go through some of the things that we can do with our ewes and does to make improvements genetically in our herd or flock. I just want to make a disclaimer to start with that I don't want to tell anyone what to do, and not all of the things that I'm going to talk about today are going to be a one-size-fits-all, but hopefully we just can get some thinking about some things that maybe we haven't thought about before and make some progress that way. So the last couple of weeks, we've talked a lot about selecting sires, whether that be through EBVs or, through our phenotypic traits that we're looking for. Sires obviously are going to be your best bet for making big steps with genetic progress because they are able to produce multiple progeny. But if you are not also thinking about the females in your herd, you're only making 50% progress rather than increasing that genetic progress by selecting your ewes and does. So a lot of times what we do every year is we go out and we say, okay, these little ewe lambs look pretty good. We'll go ahead and keep this one. This one's mom, if I remember right, did pretty well, and her grandmother did pretty well, and so I'm going to pick her. But really, at the end of the day, by just choosing on how they look or how you sort of remember in the back of your mind can be deceiving. And so how can we improve? How do we break that cycle? What we can do is keep some really good records, especially of the things that are important to you in your herd and your objectives, and go through those records before selection day and make some educated decisions based on the records that you keep. So to start doing any sort of selection process, you're going to need to have a plan, right? So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you really have outlined the objectives that you want within your production management. So are you selling lambs for meat? Are you interested in having good wool quality? Or maybe you're a dairy producer for either sheep or goats. Whatever the objectives are, put them down on paper and have a really good understanding of what you're trying to achieve. Then you can follow that up by deciding what information do you need to have to make sure that you're meeting those objectives. And then you can start to think about how are you going to use the information that you have, the records that you're keeping. How do you apply the decisions within your flock or herd? And at the end, reevaluate and make sure that you're meeting the objectives through the process that you've developed. So when you're choosing your selection criteria for your replacement animals, this is primarily where you're going to be using this, or maybe you're buying some ewes from somebody, some older ewes or does or whatever you're doing, but you have to have an understanding of what it is that you're going to be selecting on. So it's going to differ across different production settings within your operation, depending on what those objectives were that you were, that you had set for your operation. So, for example, maybe somebody who is raising a lot of lambs or kids, maybe we have an interest in the longevity of those animals, how their mothering ability is, and the different things that go along with that, milk, reproductive, all of these things. And while those few things are lower in heritability, they still can be passed down. And over time, you can make some good progress by selecting on those types of things. Growth and carcass characteristics are going to be more heritable, and if that's something that you're trying to achieve within your operation, these are things that you can do some good selection pressure on and make some pretty good progress. The one thing that we have to consider is that some of these traits you may not, you probably don't want to select on a single trait. You probably have interest in having multiple things within those selection criteria that you're going to go for. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but single trait selection is really not a great idea. And we'll talk about why that is later on. But you just have to have it in the back of your mind, or on paper is even better. What traits are important to you and what are you going to be selecting animals on? So we've, again, talked a lot about sire selection. The more records that there is on all of the progeny and any sort of ancestry that those animals have gives you better accuracy. So when you're selecting those animals, you're going to make more progress if you know their proven performance records, right? The same goes for when you're selecting your dams, and it's probably more within your own record keeping and your own operation that you're going to have these records. And so it's going to be one of those situations where you kind of have to spend some time and go back and look. If you have, 100 ewes, for example, you're not going to be able to remember each individual ewe and all the progeny she's ever had. And so having it on paper is really important. And if you link each of the progeny to the dam, you can go back through and make a better selection choice when it comes to replacements. So you want to select on traits that are heritable. The more heritable they are, and the more records that you have available to look for those trends, the more progress that you're going to make. However, I don't think it's wrong to include some of the lowly heritable traits, because still at the end of the day, what heritability means is that it's passed down genetically. So the other portion of that is environment. And so things like mothering ability, even though it may not be very high genetic heritability, if those lambs or kids are being raised by a mother who does a really nice job, that contributes from an environmental side of things. So just remember, heritability is the genetic portion, and there's also an environmental side. So when I say low heritability, that means if I have a lamb that's born, the reproductive heritability, the mothering ability from that ewe is not super high. So if I take that lamb away from the ewe right away and she's not being raised by that ewe at all, that's where you might lose some of that mothering ability. However, if you have a ewe that has great mothering ability and she can teach that lamb how to be a good mother, that's where you get that increase, if that makes sense. So some of the reproductive traits like milk, udder health, that kind of thing, they're lowly heritable. And so, for example, you probably don't want to keep ewe lambs out of a mother that has poor milk, for example. The other thing to consider when you're choosing selection criteria are that traits that you may select on can be correlated with other traits. And so you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is not selection for one thing that's going to have a negative impact on another trait. And we'll get into some of those later on. And you want to make sure that when you're choosing criteria, you're meeting objectives that you have, that you've written down. And the other thing to consider are, what are your resources? What management style do you have? What's the market that you're targeting? Some of the strengths and weaknesses in your system. And you want to make sure that if you're making selection decisions, that you can track whether or not it's working, right? So for example, if you're looking at carcass characteristics and you're trying to select on animals that have better carcass characteristics, you have to be able to track that, meaning you have to get records after the animals have been slaughtered. Growth characteristics, if you don't have a way to weigh animals individually, it might be kind of difficult to track that really finely. So you may have to just put them into frame size categories, or get good at eyeballing weights of animals, that kind of thing. Or maybe you're just interested in trying to improve on your parasite resistance within your flock or herd, and you have to be able to trace that. So you need to be able to do some FOMACHA scoring or fecal egg counts or whatever it is, so that you can make sure that when you're making these selection decisions, they're actually working in the end. So then you have this criteria that you've set and you're ready to select within your herd. So how do you do that? The main thing I've touched on already is keeping those records and keeping good records, especially of the things that are of interest to you. So one of the things you can do is really have a good way to track individual and familial performance. So that of course means anything of importance to you, growth characteristics, how well one of your dams did when she, was breeding records and that kind of thing. So you can keep track of what's going on with each individual animal and what their mothers and grandmothers were doing as well. You can evaluate animals so that you can select and cull on different types of information. You can use these records to plan for breeding. We're going to talk a little bit later about hybrid vigor and inbreeding and how we can use those as pieces of our management, but this is a way to understand how we can make those genetic progress. The other thing is you can keep track of any diseases, especially the genetically linked ones, and how well their passive immunity is working. So for example, if you're treating animals or vaccinating animals for something and the lambs are still getting those diseases, you know that whatever you're doing is not working. And we can cull animals with any of these issues to decrease the prevalence within the herd. And you want to understand how well your feeding strategy and health regime is working, as well as whether or not your genetic selection is making any progress. And that adds value to your livestock. So as a general note, these are the types of records that I recommend if you are able to, with the resources you have, able to do so. So I've labeled these in different colors so you can see keeping this type of record contributes to this type of outcome. So the first one, you keep all of your animals, have some form of identification so that you can track individuals. And that increases the management efficiency of your herd. So for my sheep, for example, I just do ear tags, but you can do a number of different things, whether they're a tattoo or a brand or any of those other things. And I have bangs tag in here because I've also given this as a beef talk as well, but just some things to think about there. If you have parentage, pedigree, progeny, any of those records that you can link to the individual, that's the gold standard because you can learn a lot from having all of those different records. You want to keep track of what you're feeding the animals, because if you're feeding the same thing to all of your animals and some of them are performing really well and some of them are not performing very well at all, then you have some information on why that might be happening. And it also helps you with your bottom line economically. And if you keep track of why an animal died or why you culled them from the herd, that will help you down the road for any of the progeny that you may have kept as replacements. And then on the other side, obviously you want to keep track of all of the things that you're doing for health. Test results, if you do any testing, vaccines, dewormers, any sort of treatment that you may give them. If they die and you do a necropsy, keep that. So all of those things can contribute as well. Primarily with your lambs and kids for the first year, the things that are important to keep track of, and like I said, not all of these are going to be things that fit your objectives or that you care about, but some of the options that I would recommend and the things that I try to keep track of within my flock are obviously birth date is important, because then you know, did mom breed up when she was supposed to? Did she gestate the period of time that she was supposed to? Any sort of issues that may have occurred during lambing or kidding. How those animals performed after they were born. So you know those babies that they're born and they just don't get up forever, and you think to yourself, when is too soon to go help them, because they don't appear to be working at it very hard and mom's not helping. And this is all stuff that you should record, because those are the kinds of things that are going to be important when this lamb or kid is rearing offspring of her own. In fact, if they are having that much trouble, I wouldn't keep them as replacements. How many siblings they have. The number of offspring is a lowly heritable trait, so you can make some progress in it if you were to add that as a piece of your selection criteria. As a whole, dystocia is pretty lowly heritable as well, and so it's one of those things where you want to keep pretty close track when you're having any difficulties lambing or kidding, what the problem was, because some of them are more environmental causes compared with genetic causes. So keeping track of milk and mothering abilities as well. All of your growth performance data. This is where if you have lambs that are just not doing very well and everybody else is growing and getting fat and looking good, and then this one's not, probably something wrong with that one. So it's good to mark that down in your records. If you do any parasite tracking, this is where you would keep it as well. And we're going to get into some of these a little bit more in detail, but the disposition, how the animals act, if they're jumping fences every time you get near them, or they've got some weirdness in their conformation for that structural soundness, what kind of frame size they have, how well they're putting on muscle, how well they're keeping their condition. Those are all things that you should consider for not keeping as replacements. And then if you're selling wool or meat, those are things to track as well. The pedigree and longevity, one of the biggest things is as your ewes are getting older, keep track as you're culling them out the reason for why they're being culled, because that can play a role in whether or not you'd want to keep a yearling on for replacement or not as well. Most of these things we've already touched on, but these are the things that you do annually. Body weight, body condition. You can see in this photo, I've got this ewe on, these are my ewes, and so I can say this with confidence. This ewe on the left, who's gained quite a bit of weight in the last month or so, which is, you know, one of those things. And then I've got this big fat ewe over here. So you can see that there's something happening within the animal rather than the feeding regime. And so this is a ewe that I will be culling this year because she had lambs and didn't have enough milk to feed them. She's just kind of a non-doer. She can't gain weight very well, and she has kind of poor conformation. And so that's one that I will not be keeping, and I won't be keeping lambs out of her either. And so you don't always know when you breed them up the first time that they're going to end up looking and performing that way. So it's just something to keep tracking year after year. Again, breeding, conception, due dates, mothering abilities, milk, lamb performance, parasite tolerance, wool and carcass traits, and any health regime that you have them on. So when it comes to replacement animals, you have your selection criteria. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do. are you going to buy or are you going to replace within your herd? So when you're buying replacements, it's important to be really cautious of why are the animals being sold in the first place? Is there something about them that the person who's selling them is culling them from their flock or herd? Do they have records to support the performance that you're looking for to meet the objectives that you have set within your herd? And if you're raising replacements, this is the time where selection is really important, and that comes with both the sire and the dam. And you want to target replacing 15 to 20% of your herd on an annual basis so that you can keep your numbers up. So now you've got your criteria, you're getting ready to make selection decisions. How do you do it? What are the best ways to do that? Single trait selection is one that I mentioned earlier that you really probably don't want to do. And the reason being that this is something that's happened a lot in the dairy industry for cattle. And you can see we've got these cows that produce enormous amounts of milk, but we have bred away from any sort of conformation and growth and mothering capabilities because of the single trait selection. And so while that works in the dairy industry, that is not going to work for your sheep and goats in most cases, right? Because you really need them to be able to raise lambs and kids. You need them to be able to grow, especially if you're making meat for people. And so while single trait selection is the greatest potential for improving a trait, it's just not going to be as good for multiple traits. The independent culling levels is one that's super easy, and if you have your records up in front of you, basically what you do is you take 2 or 3 traits that are important to you, you set a specific level that the animal has to meet to be able to be kept. And so you can apply these sequentially or all at the same time. So maybe you select for weaning weight in the fall, and then you select for, I don't know, whether or not they bred up in the spring or whatever it is that you select for your criteria. So for this example, I have gain in pounds per day here on this axis, and then I have yearling weight down at the bottom. Sorry, I'll get to that in a second, but say I set my yearling weight criteria at 120 pounds, so I draw the line right here, and this is the group of animals that you're gonna select for that. And then I'm interested in how well they're gaining. So I draw a 0.7 pounds per day mark, and the animals that I will choose are within that green circle. And so you can see now I've dropped out all of the underperforming animals for those 2 traits, and these are the animals that I'm gonna keep. So that's how you would do that type of selection. It usually works the best for 2 to 3 traits. You know, if you have 4, it's probably okay. The biggest thing is the more traits you select on, the harder it is to find enough animals that meet all of the selection criteria. And again, just because one trait is, an animal is superior in that trait, it may not be superior in the other. And so you can see this animal right here. It is at around 160 pounds of yearling weight, but it falls below the gain threshold. So you have to decide if that's going to be okay for what you're looking at doing. Another option that you can use for selection is an index. So this is one that's going to take a lot more work and a lot more record keeping to achieve, but it's very beneficial if you are able to do one like this, because you can put weights on the traits that you're looking at, meaning that maybe growth has more value to you, so you can weight it heavier compared to milk, for example. So it's still important, but it's not as important, so you can make weights, and whether that's a dollar value or a percent of whatever total value you want to come up with. So it's very effective. And like I said, it's kind of complex, but you do have support from the 3 co-hosts on this webinar that would be happy to help you with something like this. If you are interested in doing it, we can help you get set up and figure out how to weight things and get your value. But basically that just gives you a value, including all the traits that you have that you're interested in selecting for, and you can select animals based on the value that you get, this index value. And you just pick your top 10 or 20 or whatever, however many animals you're going to keep. The other question is, if I select on this trait, what response am I going to get? Is it going to be beneficial for me to select, right? That's always a question that we have. So there's a couple ways that you can improve the response that you get from genetic selection. One of the things that you want to do is to be as choosy as you possibly can, meaning that if you have 100 ewe lambs that you're selecting from and you pick 50 of them, you're going to make less genetic progress than if you chose 20 of them. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But the more specific and choosy that you get, and the higher the threshold is that you're selecting on, the more progress that you're going to make. The other thing that you can do is decrease the average age of your herd. It makes sense if you think about it from the standpoint of you're keeping ewes that you've had for 6 or 7 years, and she's continuing to throw the same genetics year after year. Whereas if you start culling earlier and keeping more replacements, you can start to gain more genetic improvement because you're having more animals that you've selected specifically for that, if that makes sense. The other thing that you can do, which is harder to do within just your own herd and your own records, but the more records that you have, the more accurate your selection will be. So, for example, if you're choosing an animal whose dam has 10 offspring, you have a better idea of how that animal is going to perform compared to another ewe that has a dam who is 1 year old, so she only has 2 offspring. I mean, I hope that makes sense, but the more information you have, the better chance you have of getting it right, if that makes sense. So here's an example of why you would want to select more choosy selection. So in this example, we're going to be selecting on yearling weight, which has a heritability of 20% in sheep and goats. And so let's have an example of 100 ewes. Say we're doing pretty well, we're throwing 2 lambs per ewe, and we have 100 ewe lambs that we wean. Okay, just for example's sake. The average age of the ewes in this example is just shy of 2.5 years old, and the average age of your rams would be 1.5 years old. And right now we're averaging our yearling weight at about 130 pounds. So if you just randomly go out and select because this ewe is kind of big right now and she looks pretty good, just remember that our single lambs and kids are going to grow faster and maybe get a little bit bigger than our twin lambs. But at the end of the day, they're all going to hit the mark of the adult animal that they're going to become. And so selecting before they've hit their mature weight, it's hard to know what you're actually selecting on, right? So you're going to select animals that are at the higher end. We're going to select 50 out of 100. And so your progress then, your top 50 for weight, yearling weight. And so you're going to gain 0.5 pound a year if you select 50. If you select only 25, you're going to gain 0.8 pounds per year. And if you only select 10, you're going to gain over 1 pound a year. So just keep in mind that each year you make progress, and over 10 years, your lambs will be 10 pounds heavier at yearling weight. Does that make sense? So the other thing that we could do was decrease the average age of the animals. So here's an example, same example, 100 ewes, 100 ewe lambs were weaned. We're going to select just the top 10. So remember when we did that, it was 1.1 pounds a year. But if we decrease the average age of our ewes down to 2 years old, you're going to gain 1.2 pounds per year. So you can see how that changes just slightly. If we instead, we say, okay, we're just going to have younger rams. So we change it from 1.5 years on average to 1 year, you're going to gain 1.3 pounds per year. And maybe you want to gain even more in this trait. So you do both. You decrease the average age of your ewes and your rams. And now you have 1.4 pounds per year. So you can see how that changes the progress that you can make just by doing those two things. And if you ever want to get with me, the math, it's kind of complex, so I didn't want to go through it today and just confuse you all. But if you're interested in learning how to do this selection response, I'm happy to help you with the trait specific to your herd. One of the things that you can do, just a quick way of determining what the response might be if you make a selection decision, is you take the average of the selected minus the average of what your herd currently is and multiply it by your heritability. So for this example, we selected all of our lambs that were an average of 137, and the threshold was over 130, right? And you subtract the 130 that is the herd average currently, multiply it by 0.2, which is the heritability of yearling weight, and you get that 1.4 pounds. So that's an easier way to do it. So you're sitting down at your records, you're saying, okay, I have 130 pounds yearling weight on average in my herd currently. I'm selecting these 10 animals and their average is 137 pounds. That's how you plug that in and you get this response. So what does that actually mean for you? 1.4 pounds a year doesn't sound like a whole lot. But if you have 100 or 1.4 pounds per year that you're gaining each year, and say we're getting $1.50 a pound for our animals when we sell, you're going to make an extra $2.10 per head. And if we have those 180 lambs that are left over from after we select the 10 ewe lambs that we're going to keep, that comes to just shy of $400 per year. So if you make an extra $400 per year, over time, that's going to add up. So that's just an example of one of the things that you can do for selection. As I've kind of touched on along the way, you have to be careful of indirect selection. So sometimes if you select on one thing, you get a positive impact on something else. So those can be indicator traits. So for example, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and mature weight are all positively correlated. So if you're selecting on animals at weaning, their yearling weight is also going to be higher compared to the others. If they're highly correlated and you want both of them to make progress, that's great. Or maybe they're not correlated at all, and that's maybe a good thing too, because then you're not affecting another trait through selection of the one that you're looking at. And it's also nice with the indicator traits that you can make progress in a trait that's difficult to measure through selection of one that you can measure. So for example, scrotal circumference is linked to fertility and age of puberty. And there's less work in this with sheep and goats, but that's something that they have linked. And so that's something you can do. So say you select a ram with higher scrotal circumference and your lambs may have more, your ewe lambs may have more potential to breed up for that first cycle than others. The other thing that I've already talked about is if you select for weaning weight, you're also selecting for yearling weight as well. But you can also make negative progress in some traits if you select on others. So some examples of that are the bigger the animal that you're selecting for, you're gonna have bigger lambs, and it's gonna be harder for them to have lambs. And so it's something to keep in the back of your mind. You don't wanna get huge animals without compensating for that somewhere else. Also, growth is negatively correlated with milking ability. So these really big muscly animals are not gonna milk as well. They're also not gonna reproduce as well. And the more muscling that you get, the less marbling that you're gonna have in the meat. And so it's just something to be aware of when you're selecting on certain things, to know how that trait is going to affect other traits, whether it's positive or negative. So we've talked a lot about selection, and I think one of the ways that you can make some really good progress is through culling. And just remember, as we go through these, if you cull for any of these things, you should mark it down in each one of her daughters as well, so that you know what to expect from the daughter. So most of these are going to be pretty lowly heritable, but again, remember the heritability is genetic and the rest is environmental. And so any animal that's being raised by their mother is going to get some of the genetic and some of the environmental from her. So disposition is a big one. If you have a ewe that's jumping over you every time you go to work her, or she's jumping fences, or she's ramming into things, and she's just not very well tempered, that's going to pass down into the offspring, especially if she raises them. Conformation, we're going to get into what that looks like in a minute. I've got some figures, but poor conformation animals are going to pass that along to their offspring, and it's usually more of an issue as they get older and things start to get a little saggy, and maybe she's just not going to be as capable of getting around on the range or gestating her offspring or whatever it is. Feet can be a big one. If she's the kind of animal that her feet grow out really fast and they get overgrown, that's one of the main contributors to, say, foot rot. So the soft, long-growing feet is one that you don't want to keep in your herd either. You want to make sure her jaw lines up. If her teeth are all lined up and her jaw is proportioned correctly and everything's good, her ability to continue to feed herself throughout her lifetime and not have teeth get overgrown or worn down, or those are all really important. And also, if a ewe comes in at 5 years old with no teeth, might not be a good idea to keep her offspring either. Her eyes, you know, everybody's aware, if they're raising sheep and goats, of entropion. That's heritable. And so anything that's funky about anything in her body, it's probably going to pass down. So just keeping that in mind. Udder condition is important to consider as well, because if she doesn't produce very much milk, or she's got some weird suspension issues, if she's prone to mastitis, if her teats get too big for the lambs to suckle, those are all things that she may pass down to her offspring as well. Reproductive ability, again, if she misses her first breeding cycle, and that's important to you as a producer to make sure that all of your dams are able to breed up and have a lamb and wean a lamb. Those are all things to keep in mind as well. Again, any type of issues that she has with lambing and kidding. Some people, it's a hard cull level if she does not have a lamb or wean a lamb, right? Some people, it might depend a little bit on why she didn't wean a lamb. Some people are concerned over having 2 lambs or kids, or 3 lambs or kids compared to 1. So these are all things that you just have to decide within your operation if that's important, and set it as a culling criteria. Body condition is one, you know, the photo I showed you before of that poor doing ewe. I will definitely be getting rid of culling her from my flock. But if you have one of those ewes that she just really never gets that fat and she's kind of small, but every year she punches out 2 big healthy lambs or kids and weans them and they look great, maybe it's okay to keep her. I mean, I would, you know. So it's one of those things that if you have it written down in your records, then you'll know. We won't beat around too much on this offspring and pedigree performance records, but those are things to consider culling animals as well. So if you cull for any of these prior reasons, you may consider culling some of her offspring as well that you may have kept as replacements. Longevity and hardiness on range are probably more important for anybody who's out obviously on range with these animals, because if they're able to go out and do well and have good teeth and bring home 2 lambs every summer and whatever it may be, those are great ewes to have around, and some of them just don't do as well, so you get rid of them. Parasite resistance, in particular for myself, I have all irrigated pasture, and parasites can become a big problem for me, and so I do tend to get rid of animals that have poor parasite resistance. So looking at the conformation that we touched on before, some of these things, how important are they really? It just depends on what you're doing. But as soon as you start to let these things get away from you and you start to have animals that just really have some knock-kneed conformation, those things can eventually affect their ability to perform, especially as they get older, like we talked. And it will affect some of the way that they're able to put on muscling. And certainly you don't want to keep breeding these things into your herd continually and not addressing them. And so in each one of these photos, the first one is the one that you want to see. Straight legs in the front. You want the hindquarters to line up with the legs in the back, and you want to have nice straight legs when you look at the rear view. Last week, Whit touched on some of this stuff that you want to consider not purchasing as sires for your herds, but within your ewes is the same deal. So the wool that's covering, especially the reproductive areas, you want to make sure that you don't get things bound up and make it difficult for her to have a lamb, raise a lamb, that kind of thing. When you have lower crutch and breech coverings, that's less work you have to do for, say you're lambing early and you have to go out and shear off some of the wool in these areas to make it more simple for her to raise a lamb. If you just breed some of that out, you don't have to worry about it as much. Entropion is an example of something that you want to cull out of your herd at all costs, because it is heritable and it is an awful thing to have to deal with. So it's where this eyelid is bent over and rubbing on the eyeball. So anytime you see that, don't breed her, get rid of her. For sheep producers, this wool blindness, again, Whit talked about that last week, but this poor girl, how could she possibly do a good job raising lambs when she can't even see where she's going, right? And then this is going back to that jaw placement and making sure that things are lined up, which is what you want to see here in the middle. So overbite and underbite are heritable as well, and not going to be something that contributes to longevity for sure. So the last couple of things I wanted to touch on are improving genetics within your herd through crossbreeding. So what happens here if you're not a seed stock producer and you're not trying to sell purebred animals of any kind? crossbreeding can be a really great way to improve genetically through mating different breeds. And so maybe you have a herd of does that they're just really hardy on whatever range or pasture you're putting them on, and they're great mothers, but they're just not producing kids that are putting on any muscle that you want to sell for meat. So this is where you would bring in that meat breed sire to get those kids to perform a little better on the growth side of things, while not sacrificing the mothering ability or the performance on range or whatever it is that's really important to you from the side of the animals that you're keeping all the time. So you can maximize your hybrid vigor, which is what I was referring to there, where you get the best traits from both breeds. So you maximize by not having any breed overlap. So you breed 2 different breeds of goats or sheep, and you select each of the parents for those traits of interest that you're interested in having more of. And the breed complementarity then is where you have those good, strong paternal traits with your sires and the strong maternal traits with your dams. And then when you're having offspring, you get the best of both worlds. So this is a great way to make genetic progress in multiple traits. And you can also incorporate some of that environmental effect. So if you have animals that are doing really well given the environment, you're able to pass that down to the offspring better. And I would be remiss if I didn't touch on inbreeding versus line breeding. When you're trying to make genetic progress, especially when you're raising your own replacements, this is very important to consider. So as we all know, line breeding is a version of inbreeding, which means that the animals are related in some fashion genetically, but we're trying to increase that variation. So we concentrate the genes that are favorable. So for example, if we have animals that are growing really well and we want to maximize the ability for the offspring to have those growth traits, you can put 2 related animals together and get that superiority through that. So an example of something you could do, growth, if you're trying to breed out horns, the polled animals are dominant, and so you can start to breed out and get double dominant genes, right? However, because we have the increase in homozygosity, meaning that 2 genes could be the same because they come from similar genetic lines, you're going to eventually reach a point where you decline the vigor of the animals, meaning your lambs are going to be off to a really slow start maybe when they're born, or maybe they just don't do that well throughout their life. You're going to slow the rate of your genetic progress at a certain level of inbreeding. And anytime that you have one of those really nasty recessive genetic defects like spider lamb disease, cryptorchidism, entropion, or myotonia, those are all going to start to reveal themselves the more inbreeding that's happening within your herd. So just as an example, when you breed a father to a daughter, that daughter shares 50% of his genes. And so she has a 50% chance of getting the same gene matched up with the gene she has, meaning that you could get these really cool superior traits, or you could get some of these really bad recessive traits. I hope I'm explaining that well, but so 50% relatedness sire to daughter, 50% relatedness from full siblings. So if you're breeding a full brother to a full sister, 50% relatedness. If you're breeding half siblings, meaning that maybe 2 animals out of 1 sire with different mothers, you hit the 25% relatedness mark. So these are inbreeding coefficients. So the rule of thumb is once you reach 30% relatedness, and keep in mind these are all additive, you are more likely to see some of these recessive genetic defects because you have a higher chance of joining two genes that are the same, which is homozygosity. So this is a good reason to bring in outside genes. And if you're going to raise all of your replacements within your flock, you have to be very careful about mating. So it's just something to consider because, you know, some of the genetic defects that can happen aren't these really obvious ones either. Sometimes you get ones where they don't have a complete digestive system and it takes them a couple weeks to die slowly and miserably, or maybe they have some sort of just all kinds of different performance and stuff like that that could be really nasty to watch, and it's something that you can avoid. So something to think about there. And I guess with that, that's kind of all that I had for you guys today. And again, I'm not pushing any of this on you. It's just some food for thought. And if any of it fits your operation and you want to start incorporating it, please give me a shout. My email is right up there. And I can help you with some of the indexes or how to go about doing some of this stuff if that's helpful to you. So any questions?
Yeah, we had one question from Janice Willard. She asked, how heritable is temperament? We bought a ram one time who was very flighty, difficult to handle daughters. They had some other good traits, but we ended up not keeping them.
Yeah, so temperament is lowly heritable, but it is heritable. So I think one of the things in particular with temperament is it can be passed down genetically, but then you also have that environmental thing. And so like, for example, if you have a lamb that's born to a dam that's really, really flighty and nasty to work with, you could pull that lamb and raise it yourself as a bum lamb or whatever, and they may not have quite as much. You're still going to see a little bit of that temperament in them. So to me, it's kind of a combined deal, right? So if they're already having a tendency to have a bad temperament, and then you put them with other animals that have a bad temperament, it's going to just make it worse. So I think especially with that ram that you bought, he already had the bad temperament and he passed it down, and I bet you some of those lambs were hanging out with each other, and it just kind of exacerbates. And so I guess at the end of the day, I just suggest to get rid of anything that's difficult to work with like that.
Okay, great. So we have another question from Brett Wilder. He said, great presentation. Can you recommend a herd data management software, or what do you use to keep track?
Carmen, you actually may be able to help me with some of that on the goat side. I don't have a good answer for that because I have not spent a lot of time looking into it, but I will. If I find something, I will put it up on the Facebook page. I just use Excel, but I also don't have a huge flock, so it's easier for me to keep track. So let me do some research and try to get back to you. Feel free to shoot me an email if you want a more direct response to you.
So yeah, so for our goat herd, we use a computer program called Easy Keeper. We pay, I can't remember, we have an annual subscription, and so in that system we can track their registrations, which is handy when you're registering animals. We can track, like we can put in dates that we saw them exposed to the buck, and then that calculates their kidding dates for us. It keeps track of our milk records. We can put our milk data in it. It also keeps track of carcass records. So if we get carcass data back, we can put it in there and then track that all to the buck or the doe. So for goat, it's really set up for goats, not buck or not sheep, but it's a good program for anybody that has goats. And then someone named Tara commented Livestock is a great app for keeping track of livestock. They use it for sheep. So maybe that's another program that you could try. But if anybody's interested in that Easy Keeper, they do have like free trials if you want to attempt to use it. Okay, and then we had one more question. They said my lambs usually have human eyes. I think they're like saying the reflectiveness of the eyes instead of a goat eye at night. What does that mean? Or is it heritable? I think was part of the question.
I might be misunderstanding the question, but I'm not sure that I am familiar with that. So I can't really speak to that, I guess.
I'm not. I tried to look some things up and I didn't see anything.
Yeah. Sorry. If you could shoot me an email with some more information on that, I'd be happy to look into it for you.
Okay.
Cool.
I don't see any more questions, so I guess we'll conclude today. Thank you, Melinda, for your presentation. Next week, I will be speaking on early season breeding for sheep and goats. So for individuals that breed, early August to hit that early January timeframe for the 4-H and FFA market, this presentation will be on different management techniques and a little bit on synchronization protocols to achieve that early season breeding. So I guess if you guys have any more questions, you can email Melinda, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Carmen.
Yep.